The Safra family represents one of the oldest and most secretive banking dynasties in the world. Their name is synonymous with private wealth, gold trading, and a level of discretion that borders on obsession. Their origins trace back to the Sephardic Jewish community of Aleppo, Syria, where they financed camel caravans and traded precious metals under the Ottoman Empire. This ancient lineage was transformed into a modern global power by two men, Jacob Safra, the patriarch, who fled instability in Beirut to found Safra Bank in Brazil in 1955, and his son, Edmond J. Safra, a banking prodigy who built a parallel empire in Europe and New York, culminating in the Republic National Bank of New York. By 1999, the family's interconnected banks were a juggernaut, leading to a nearly $10 billion sale to HSBC. But the Safra dynasty is not defined by its quiet success. It is defined by its contradictions, its immense targeted philanthropy, including the funding of synagogues worldwide and groundbreaking Parkinson's research, stands in stark contrast to decades of suspicion. The family's history is shadowed by relentless allegations of ties to money laundering, international scandals, and, most famously, the bizarre, fiery death of Edmond Safra in his Monaco penthouse, a tragedy that raised more questions than it answered, leaving the family name shrouded in mystery. Long before the Safra name echoed in Swiss private banks or on Wall Street, it was already synonymous with power in an entirely different marketplace. It begins in the ancient, bustling courtyards of Aleppo, Syria, one of the oldest, continuously inhabited cities on Earth. For centuries, Aleppo was a critical crossroads of global trade, the western terminus of the Silk Road, a place where merchants haggling in Arabic, Turkish, and Hebrew exchanged spices from India, silks from China, and, most importantly, gold. The Safras were pillars of Aleppo's vibrant Sephardic Jewish community. The name Safra itself, derived from the Arabic word for yellow or gold, was not just a name, it was a job description. They were goldsmiths, money changers, and financiers. Their business, established as early as the mid-19th century under the Ottoman Empire, was built on one commodity that transcended borders, empires, and religions: trust. The Safra family specialized in financing the camel caravans that crisscrossed the deserts, moving goods between the Mediterranean coast and the far reaches of Mesopotamia and Persia. This was a business built on reputation. A merchant's note bearing the Safra name was as good as gold in any souk from Baghdad to Beirut. They mastered the complex ancient systems of Hawala, a trust-based money transfer network that operated without promissory notes, relying solely on family honor and intricate ledgers. They understood how to weigh currencies, assess political risk, and move precious metals discreetly across unstable borders. This ancient banking tradition was the birthright of Jacob Safra, the patriarch who would carry the family name into the 20th century. Born in 1895, Jacob learned the trade at his father's side. He was not just a banker, he was a master of arbitrage, understanding how to profit from the tiny discrepancies in the price of gold and silver between different markets. But the world that had sustained his family for generations was collapsing. The Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, was crumbling. And the outbreak of World War I in 1914 shattered the old caravan routes forever. The old order was dying. Jacob Safra, recognizing that the future no longer lay in the ancient markets of Aleppo, made the first of the family's great strategic pivots. He moved his operations to the burgeoning cosmopolitan port city of Beirut, Lebanon. In 1920, he founded the J.E. Safra Bank in Beirut. This was a significant step. He was moving from the informal, trust-based system of his ancestors to a formal European-style banking house. Beirut in the 1920s, under the French Mandate, was the Paris of the Middle East, a vibrant hub of commerce, culture, and finance. Jacob's bank thrived, serving the city's wealthy merchant class, which included not just his fellow Sephardic Jews, but also Christian Arabs and Sunni Muslims. He continued to specialize in gold and foreign exchange, the skills he had perfected in Aleppo, but now applied them to a modern international clientele. It was into this world that his most famous son, Edmond J. Safra, was born in 1932. Edmond was a banking prodigy, the scion who would not just inherit the family business, but revolutionize it. The Safra family, which included Jacob's other sons Ali and Moise, was intensely private and deeply devout. The children were raised in a trilingual environment, speaking Arabic at home, French in the elite schools of Beirut, and Hebrew in the synagogue. But Edmond's true education took place at his father's bank. According to family legend, Edmond's financial acumen was so pronounced that he was balancing the bank's books by the age of 12. By 15, he was a full-time employee, deeply immersed in the complex world of currency arbitrage and precious metals trading. He was not just learning a trade, he was inheriting a 1,000-year-old mindset. He learned the Safra way: protect the depositor above all else, maintain high liquidity, avoid risky loans, and above all, discretion. A Safra banker did not speak of his client's business, ever. This idyllic, prosperous life in Beirut was shattered by the same geopolitical forces that had destroyed the Ottoman Empire, the Arab-Israeli War of 1948. The creation of the State of Israel sent shockwaves across the Arab world. In Lebanon, the delicate political balance between Christians and Muslims was destabilized. Anti-Jewish sentiment, once rare in cosmopolitan Beirut, began to rise. The economic climate grew hostile. Jewish-owned businesses were targeted, and their assets became insecure. Jacob Safra, who had seen the collapse of one empire, recognized the signs of another. The stability that had allowed his bank to flourish was gone. He knew his family and their fortune was no longer safe in the Middle East. It was time to move again. This exodus was a pivotal strategic decision that would define the Safra dynasty's modern global structure. The family did not move en masse to one new location. Instead, they diversified their risk, a classic Safra financial strategy applied to their own survival. They split. Jacob Safra, along with his sons Ali and Moise, set his sights on Brazil. In 1952, they emigrated to São Paulo, a booming, chaotic industrial metropolis in the New World. It was a perfect Safra market, a high-inflation, high-growth economy with a desperate need for sophisticated financial services and access to global capital. In 1955, Jacob founded Safra Bank, which would, under the brilliant and aggressive leadership of Joseph and Moise, grow to become one of the largest and most powerful private banks in all of Latin America. Edmond, however, did not go with them. At just 16 years old, Edmond J. Safra, the prodigy, was sent on a different path. His father, recognizing his unique preternatural talent for finance, sent him not to the emerging markets but to the old ones, Europe. His first stop was Milan, Italy, in 1949. The story of Edmond's arrival in post-war Italy is the stuff of financial legend. He arrived as a teenager, fluent in French and Arabic, with a working knowledge of finance and a deep understanding of gold. Italy, at the time, was in economic chaos. The lira was unstable and the government had imposed strict currency controls. Wealthy Italian families, terrified of inflation and political instability, were desperately trying to get their money out of the country. They were willing to pay a massive premium for the one asset they trusted: gold. Edmond with his family's ancient connections in the gold trade, was perfectly positioned to be the middleman. He allegedly began a simple but wildly profitable arbitrage operation. He would use his network to acquire gold in free market gold bazaars, and then arrange for it to be smuggled into Italy, where he could sell it for a huge markup in liras. He would then use those liras to buy other assets or exploit the black market for currency exchange. He was, as one biographer noted, a one-man financial whirlwind. By his own account, by the time he was 18, he had already made a personal fortune of $40 million. This early success in the chaotic gray markets of post-war Europe defined Edmond's modus operandi. He was not a traditional white shoe banker who lent money to corporations. He was a private banker, a man who served the needs of the ultra-wealthy, particularly those in unstable regions, who needed to move their money quietly and keep it safe. His clients were not companies, they were families. Middle Eastern merchants, Greek shipping magnates, wealthy Latin Americans, and fellow Sephardic Jews displaced from the Arab world. In 1956, at the age of 24, Edmond took his massive self-made fortune and founded his first great institution, the Trade Development Bank in Geneva, Switzerland. The choice of Geneva was brilliant. It was the global capital of private banking, a city synonymous with secrecy, stability, and the Swiss franc. Edmond, the young prodigy from Beirut, was now competing directly with the centuries-old aristocratic Protestant banks of Switzerland. He built his bank on the principles his father had taught him: high liquidity and paranoid caution. While other banks might leverage their deposits 10-to-1 on risky loans, Edmond's bank kept an enormous portion of its assets in cash. His motto was that he must have $1 in the till for every dollar on deposit. This conservative, fortress-like approach was a magnet for nervous money. Wealthy clients from the unstable Middle East, Latin America, and Africa flocked to him. They didn't care that his bank paid lower interest rates. They cared that their principal was safe. Edmond Safra was not selling high returns. He was selling security. The Trade Development Bank was a phenomenal success. Edmond's personal touch was legendary. He treated his clients' money as if it were his own sacred trust. He was available to them 24/7, a personal financial consigliere. He built his bank from an initial $1 million in capital into a $5 billion powerhouse by the early 1980s. While Edmond was building his European empire, his brothers Moise and Joseph Safra were executing the other half of the family's pincer movement in Brazil. Jacob Safra died in 1963, leaving the Brazilian operation in their hands. Joseph, in particular, proved to be a banker of equal, if not greater, ruthlessness than Edmond. Brazil in the 1960s and 70s was a cauldron of military dictatorships, hyperinflation, and explosive industrial growth. Joseph and Moise navigated this treacherous environment perfectly. Banco Safra became the bank for Brazil's wealthy elite. They financed industries, managed family fortunes, and, like Edmond, built a reputation for fortress-like security in an unstable economy. They grew to become the sixth largest bank in Brazil, making Joseph and Moise two of the richest men on the continent. The family's two-pronged strategy had worked. Jacob Safra's flight from Beirut had resulted in the creation of two massive, independent, but philosophically aligned banking empires, one in Europe and one in South America, collectively controlling tens of billions of dollars. But Edmond's ambition was not limited to Geneva. He saw the need for a U.S. dollar-based institution to serve his international clients. In 1966, he founded the Republic National Bank of New York. Republic was a different kind of bank. It was not just a discreet private bank for billionaires. It was also a high-end retail bank for savvy, wealthy immigrants. He located its branches in neighborhoods populated by prosperous immigrant communities, Jews, Italians, Greeks, and later Latin Americans and Russians. He understood their old world mentality. They distrusted complex investments, they feared debt, and they loved gold. Republic National Bank became one of the largest retailers of precious metals and gold coins to the public. Edmond was, in effect, bringing the gold trading mentality of the Aleppo souk to Main Street, USA. The bank was wildly successful, growing to 80 branches and becoming, by 1999, the third largest bank in the New York metropolitan area, measured by deposits. It, too, was run on the same Safra principle, acting as a safe harbor for his clients' dollar-based assets. Edmond, now a global banking titan, had built his empire. He had established his golden triangle of power: the Trade Development Bank in Geneva, the Republic National Bank of New York, and, in 1988, the Safra Republic Holdings in Luxembourg, a private banking hub designed to optimize tax efficiency for his European clients. But it was this very success, this massive global network of discrete private banks, catering to the world's richest and most secretive individuals, that brought him into conflict with one of the most powerful and aggressive financial institutions on earth, American Express. In 1983, Edmond Safra made a rare strategic miscalculation. He was growing older, his health was beginning to show the first signs of strain, and he decided to sell his beloved Trade Development Bank in Geneva. The buyer was American Express, who paid $450 million for it, seeking to bolt Safra's high-net-worth private clients onto their own credit card and travel check empire. The culture clash was immediate and catastrophic. Amex was a public, aggressive, marketing-driven American corporation. Safra's bank was a secretive, conservative, relationship-based family office. Safra's clients, loyal to him personally, began to pull their money out. Edmond, who had stayed on in a management role, clashed bitterly with the Amex executives. He quit in frustration. What happened next became one of the most infamous and vicious corporate vendettas of the 1980s. American Express, furious at Safra for what they saw as poaching his old clients and undermining their new acquisition, allegedly launched a global smear campaign to destroy his reputation. According to later investigations in Safra's own lawsuit, Amex executives allegedly hired operatives and journalists to plant false, damaging stories about Edmond Safra in the international press. These were not mere criticisms of his business practices, they were toxic, career-ending allegations. The planted stories claimed that Safra was not just a banker, but a criminal. They falsely linked him to money laundering for the Colombian drug cartels, to the Iran-Contra arms for hostages scandal, and to the criminal regime of Panama's dictator, Manuel Noriega. The smear campaign was designed to destroy the one asset a banker cannot live without: his reputation. For a man who built his entire empire on trust and security, these allegations were a corporate assassination attempt. Edmond Safra, the quiet man from Aleppo, did something no one expected. He fought back, and he fought dirty. He hired his own team of high-powered investigators and lawyers, including the future New York District Attorney Robert Morgenthau. He traced the smears back to their source. He found the journalists who had been paid to plant the stories. He uncovered the internal Amex memos and the operatives who had orchestrated the campaign. In 1989, facing a mountain of irrefutable evidence, American Express was forced into a humiliating public surrender. The company issued a formal public apology to Edmond Safra, admitting to the defamatory and false campaign. They agreed to pay $8 million in damages. Edmond, in a final brilliant PR move, immediately announced that the entire $8 million settlement would be donated to charity, primarily to the International Red Cross. He had not only won, he had taken the moral high ground. He had proven his integrity and exposed the corruption of his rival. But the American Express scandal, though a victory, left a deep and lasting scar. It was the first time the Safra family's quiet power had been dragged into a public, dirty fight. It exposed the vulnerabilities of their intensely private, offshore banking model to public suspicion. And, ironically, it was a battle against false allegations of money laundering that would set the stage for the real money laundering scandals involving the Russian oligarchy that would consume his bank just a decade later, a scandal that would form the dark, paranoid backdrop to his final, fiery night in Monaco. The vicious public smear campaign by American Express in the 1980s was a profound violation of the Safra family's core code of silence and discretion. But its failure, culminating in a humiliating public apology and an $8 million payout from Amex, served a different purpose. It vindicated Edmond J. Safra. He had been publicly accused of laundering money for drug cartels and dictators, and he had been proven innocent. The victory cemented his reputation as an untouchable, honorable, and intensely private banker. It was ironically the greatest marketing coup of his life, reinforcing his core brand, absolute security. This reputation was the foundation upon which he had built his three-pillared global empire. This global machine, built to serve the world's most nervous money, was so discreet, so secure, that it inevitably attracted suspicion. The very secrecy that was his greatest selling point was also his greatest liability. The American Express smear campaign had failed because it was false, but it had planted a seed. It had shown the world that Safra's network was built for the kind of clients, dictators, cartels, spies, that Amex had falsely accused him of serving. By the 1990s, as the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, a new, massive wave of nervous money was flooding the globe. This was not the wealth of old-world aristocrats. It was the raw, chaotic, and often criminal plunder of the former Soviet state. And this flood of money would lead Edmond Safra, the cautious man who avoided all risk, into the greatest and ultimately fatal risk of his life. The story begins in 1996. Safra, always a shrewd investor, saw a massive opportunity in the Wild West capitalism of post-Soviet Russia. He became one of the founding investors and bankers for a new ambitious Moscow-based fund, Hermitage Capital Management. The fund was run by a young, aggressive American-born financier named Bill Browder. Safra's investment in Hermitage was a logical, if risky, move. He was betting on the new Russia. But this investment plugged his banks directly into the heart of the emerging Russian oligarchy, a world of untold wealth and brutal gangster-style politics. Then in August 1998, the Russian economy imploded. The government defaulted on its domestic debt and the ruble collapsed. The International Monetary Fund, backed by the U.S. Treasury, scrambled to prevent a total meltdown, arranging a multi-billion-dollar bailout package to stabilize the country. What happened next became one of the greatest financial scandals of the 20th century, and it flowed directly through Edmond Safra's New York bank. A significant portion of the IMF bailout money, estimated by investigators at between $7 and $10 billion, was almost instantly stolen. The funds, intended to stabilize the Russian currency, were allegedly diverted by a small group of powerful oligarchs at the center of Boris Yeltsin's government. This inner circle, known as the family, allegedly included figures like Boris Berezovsky and Roman Abramovich. This stolen money, billions of dollars in US and IMF funds, needed to be laundered. It had to be moved out of Russia, cleaned, and integrated into the Western financial system. The primary conduit for this massive wave of dirty money was the Bank of New York. In 1998, U.S. federal investigators, including the FBI and the Treasury, launched a massive investigation into the Bank of New York, suspecting it was the primary hub for this Russian money laundering operation. But the money didn't just stop at Boney. To move the money further, Boney relied on correspondent accounts at other banks. One of its most important correspondent partners, investigators discovered, was Edmond Safra's Republic National Bank of New York. The stolen billions were allegedly flowing from Russian banks like Menatep and SBS Agro through the Bank of New York and then being dispersed through accounts at Republic. Edmond Safra's fortress of solitude, his bank built on secrecy and security, was now implicated as a key node in the largest money laundering scandal in the world. What happened next is the pivot on which the entire Safra mystery turns. Edmond Safra, facing the nightmare of a massive federal investigation that threatened to destroy his reputation far more completely than the Amex smear, did not stonewall. He did not plead ignorance. He made a decision that, according to many close to him, would ultimately cost him his life. He decided to cooperate. Safra and his compliance officers at Republic, particularly a banker named Natasha Gerfinkel, had allegedly already detected the suspicious multi-billion-dollar wire transfers. They had, in fact, been the ones to first file suspicious activity reports with the U.S. Treasury, effectively becoming the whistleblowers for the entire scandal. Now, Safra opened his books to the FBI in the U.S. Attorney's Office. He became their star witness. He, more than any other banker, had the records, the wire transfers, and the knowledge to expose exactly how the Russian oligarchy, including figures like Berezovsky and Abramovich, had allegedly stolen the IMF money and laundered it through New York. As 1999 began, Safra was reportedly meeting with FBI agents, preparing to give testimony that could put some of the most powerful and dangerous men in Russia in prison. Edmond Safra was now in an impossible position. He was 67 years old. He was in the worsening grip of Parkinson's disease, a debilitating neurological condition that left him physically frail, often unable to walk and, according to his staff, increasingly paranoid. And he had just made himself the number one enemy of the Russian mob and its powerful oligarch masters. He was terrified. He became a recluse, retreating to his homes in Geneva in the south of France, surrounded by a private, heavily armed security team of ex-Israeli commandos. He believed and reportedly told friends that he was a marked man. He needed an exit strategy. He needed to get out to protect his family and to secure his fortune. In 1999, he announced the culmination of his life's work. He was selling his entire banking empire, Republic National Bank of New York and Safra Republic Holdings, to the global banking giant HSBC. The price was a staggering $9.85 billion in cash. This was his golden parachute. It was a way to convert his high-risk, high-profile, and now deeply compromised network of private banks into clean, liquid, and safe money. The proceeds would go to his wife, Lily, his extended family, and his new, massive Edmond J. Safra Philanthropic Foundation. He was cashing out, securing his legacy, and preparing to retire from a game that had become too dangerous. But the past had one last card to play. As the HSBC deal was being finalized, the Bank of New York/Russian money laundering scandal broke wide open in the international press. The headlines were screaming about Republic Bank's involvement. HSBC's shareholders panicked. They were not just buying a safe, profitable private bank. They were buying a massive, unfolding criminal investigation and the potential for billions in fines. HSBC's stock plummeted. The deal was on the verge of collapse. To save the acquisition, Edmond Safra was forced into a final humiliating negotiation. He had to give his buyers a discount to cover the Russia risk. In late 1999, the sale price was officially reduced by $450 million. This discount was the final public proof of the scandal. Safra, the man who had defeated American Express, had been forced to pay nearly $500 million to make his Russian problem go away. The deal was finally done. The $9.4 billion was transferred. Edmond Safra was, at last, free. He was arguably the richest private banker in the world, his fortune secured. He was also the FBI's star witness in a case against the Russian oligarchy. He was a very sick man, suffering from debilitating Parkinson's, and he was, by all accounts, living in a state of profound, constant, and justifiable terror. He retreated to his ultimate fortress, his penthouse apartment in Monaco. It was a multi-story bunker protected by bulletproof glass, steel-reinforced doors, and his team of elite Israeli bodyguards. It was, he believed, the safest place on earth. He was wrong. In the final months of 1999, Edmond J. Safra was a man living in a fortress, both externally and internally. He had successfully navigated the greatest risk of his career, the Russian money laundering scandal that had consumed his New York bank. He had cooperated with the FBI. He had sold his global empire to HSBC for $9.4 billion in cash, converting his high-risk network into pure, liquid wealth. He had, in effect, cashed out of the game, but the game was not finished with him. Edmond, now 67, was profoundly ill. His Parkinson's disease, a condition he had hidden for years, had become severe. It ravaged his body, causing violent tremors, robbing him of his mobility, and leaving him frail and dependent. His staff noted he had also lost his sense of smell, a common symptom, leading him to favor powerful Slatkin & Company scented candles to perfume his rooms. But the disease's worst symptom was paranoia. This was not a vague anxiety. It was a deep, clinical, and, in Safra's case, completely justifiable terror. He was the star witness in a $10 billion scandal involving the most dangerous men in the world, the Russian oligarchs he was preparing to testify against. He believed and told those closest to him that he was a marked man. He was convinced that assassins, likely from the Russian mafia, were coming for him. His life became a series of elaborate security protocols. He traveled with a private, heavily armed security team of ex-Israeli Special Forces commandos, and he retreated to what he believed was the safest place on earth, his Monaco penthouse. The apartment known as La Belle Époque was not a home, it was a bunker. It was a sprawling two-story, 18,000-square-foot residence that occupied the top floors of a building overlooking the Mediterranean. But this building was not just any residential tower. It also housed one of his banks, the Safra Republic Bank of Monaco. The penthouse was a fortress, protected by bulletproof glass, steel-reinforced doors, a state-of-the-art alarm system, and its own self-contained fireproof wing. At its heart was an inner sanctum, a massive master bathroom and dressing room area reinforced with steel and armored plating, which Edmond used as his personal safe room. This was where Edmond Safra intended to live out his days, shielded from the world, managing his new massive philanthropic foundation, and awaiting the birth of his first grandchild. He was surrounded by a 24/7 staff of nurses, butlers, and his private security detail. On the night of December 2nd, 1999, the penthouse was staffed as usual. Edmond's wife, Lily Safra, a glamorous and powerful socialite who'd been married 3 times before, was present, but in her own separate wing of the massive apartment. The couple, due to Edmond's illness and his erratic sleep schedule, often slept in different quarters. Edmond himself was under the direct care of 2 private nurses. One was Vivian Torrente, a veteran trusted nurse who had been with him for years and understood his complex medical needs. The other was a new addition, an American nurse named Ted Maher. Maher was, on paper, a perfect, security-minded caregiver. He was a 41-year-old former Green Beret, a medic who had served in the U.S. Army Special Forces. He was strong, military-trained, and seemingly ideal for protecting a high-profile paranoid patient. But Maher also had a troubled history, including a past he had concealed, and he reportedly felt underpaid and underappreciated in the high-stress, high-wealth environment of the Safra household. The night proceeded normally. Edmond was reportedly feeling unwell, suffering from stomach pains. Maher and Torrente were on duty, tending to him in his wing of the penthouse. Lily Safra was in her own wing, several rooms, and a large atrium away. At approximately 4:45 a.m. on December 3rd, the tranquility of the fortress was shattered. Ted Maher burst into the kitchen where other staff members were present. He was bleeding from knife wounds to his thigh and stomach. He was hysterical. He claimed the penthouse was under attack. He shouted that 2 masked, black-clad intruders had broken into the apartment. He said they had attacked him with a knife as he tried to defend Mr. Safra, and that he had managed to fight them off, but they were still in the penthouse. He claimed they were now after his patient. As Maher was telling his story, a fire alarm began to blare. Smoke was beginning to pour from Edmond's wing. The staff's reaction was immediate panic. Maher's story, combined with the fire, confirmed Edmond Safra's worst, oft-stated fears. The assassins had come. The staff immediately fled the penthouse to safety. In the midst of this chaos, Maher ran back toward Safra's wing, ostensibly to save his patient. He reached the secure bedroom area and found that Edmond, hearing the commotion and Maher's cries of intruders, had done exactly what his paranoia dictated. He had retreated to his inner sanctum. He and his loyal nurse, Vivian Torrente, had locked themselves inside the armored bathroom, the bunker. At the same time, Lily Safra, in her separate wing, woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of alarms. She, too, believed the assassins had arrived. She and a guest fled her wing, escaping unharmed onto a neighboring terrace. The phone lines were still working. What followed was a series of agonizing, fatal phone calls. Lily, now safely outside, called her husband, who was locked inside the secure bathroom with Vivian. She told him the firefighters were on their way. She begged him to unlock the door, to get out, to come to safety. Edmond refused. He was, by all accounts, terrified. He told his wife that he could not open the door. He was convinced that the intruders Maher had described were just outside the bathroom, waiting to kill him. He believed the fire was a diversion, a tactic to smoke him out of his safe room. He told her he would wait for the police, for his own security team. He trusted no one. This decision, born of a deep, reasonable paranoia, was a fatal mistake. There were no intruders. The only threat was the smoke. The Monaco fire and police departments arrived on the scene with staggering, almost comical incompetence. When they arrived, they were met by a bleeding Ted Maher, who repeated his story. 2 intruders, armed, still inside. This changed everything. The fire brigade, now believing they were facing armed assassins holding a billionaire hostage, stopped. They refused to enter the penthouse. They did not deploy their ladders to the upper floor windows. Instead, they waited, deferring to the Monaco police, who began a slow, cautious operation to secure the perimeter. For over 2 hours, as the fire raged and thick, black, toxic smoke filled the penthouse. The rescue teams waited outside. They made no serious attempt to breach the fortress. Safra's own private security team, who knew the building's complex layout, were allegedly kept from the scene by the Monaco police, who insisted on following their own protocol. The phone calls continued. Lily Safra, from outside, pleaded with her husband. The police, from the lobby, tried to reach him. Edmond, his Parkinson's afflicted voice growing weaker, repeated his refusal. He was safe in his bunker, he insisted. He would wait for his own security. He did not, or could not, understand that the bunker was not airtight. The smoke, thick with burning acrylic and chemicals from the modern furnishings, was seeping in through the ventilation shafts. Finally, after 3 agonizing hours after the fire had largely burned itself out, and it was clear no armed commandos were present, the fire brigade made their way to the master suite. They found the armored door to the bathroom locked from the inside. They forced it open. The scene inside was horrific. The room was not touched by flames, but it was thick with soot. On the floor, they found the bodies of Edmond J. Safra and his loyal nurse, Vivian Torrente. They had not been shot. They had not been stabbed. They had died a slow, agonizing death from smoke inhalation. Safra's body, exposed to the intense heat and superheated toxic gases, was reportedly found charred and unrecognizable. The fortress he had built to protect himself from assassins had become his tomb, a smoke-filled gas chamber from which he had refused to escape. The investigation began immediately, and the intruder story, the very story that had paralyzed the rescue, fell apart in less than 24 hours. There was no sign of a forced entry. The building's vaunted security system had not registered any breach. The masked men Marr had described were not on any security cameras. And most damningly, the wounds on Ted Marr's body were examined by doctors. They were clean, superficial, and, according to medical experts, perfectly self-inflicted. They were the hesitant, shallow cuts of a man trying to harm himself, not the deep, violent thrusts of an assassin. The Monaco police, now facing international humiliation for their bungled response, turned their full attention on the hero. They found the source of the fire, a metal wastebasket in the bathroom antechamber, just outside the secure bunker where Safra and his nurse were found. Inside the wastebasket, they found the remnants of burned paper or tissues, and, according to some reports, residue from Slatkin-scented candles. And then, investigators found a second separate point of origin for a fire in another part of the wing. This suggested the fire was not an accident, but a deliberate staged event. Under intense round-the-clock questioning, Ted Mayer's story collapsed. Finally, he gave a confession that was as bizarre as the crime itself. There were no intruders. There was no attack. It was all a ploy. Mayer confessed that he had started the fire himself. His alleged motive was not murder, but a twisted fantasy of heroism. He was, he claimed, unhappy with his salary and felt disrespected by the other staff. He had concocted a plan to make himself indispensable to the billionaire. He would stage an attack. He would start a small, manageable fire in the wastebasket. He would then stab himself superficially. He would fight off the imaginary intruders, rescue his patient from the fire, and become a hero in the eyes of Edmond Safra. He imagined Safra, overwhelmed with gratitude, would reward him with promotions, vast sums of money, and the respect he felt he deserved. But the plan went horribly wrong. The fire, fed by the acrylic wastebasket and the modern synthetic furnishings, had flashed over, spreading with a speed he never anticipated. and he had never factored in the one variable that made the plan fatal: Edmond Safra's paranoia. He had created a scenario, intruders, that perfectly matched his patient's deepest fears, causing Safra to lock himself away from rescue. Maher, the Green Beret medic, had intended to be a hero, but had instead become a killer. This was the official story, the one the Monaco prosecution presented to the world. But it was immediately and forcefully challenged. Heidi Mayer, Ted's wife, launched a media campaign from the United States claiming her husband was a scapegoat. She alleged that his confession was coerced. She claimed the Monaco police, desperate to close the case and avoid implications of a professional hit on their safe soil, had tortured her husband. She alleged they had kept him awake for 3 days, denied him access to proper legal counsel, tied him to a gurney, and refused to remove a painful catheter until he signed the confession they had written for him. The lone disgruntled nurse theory also failed to satisfy the international press, particularly the investigative journalist Dominic Dunn, who covered the case for Vanity Fair. The inconsistencies were too glaring. First, there was the second source of fire. Maher's confession focused on the wastebasket. How did the second separate fire start? Second, there was the Monaco police response. Their sheer ineptitude, their refusal to act for hours while a man was dying, seemed to many to be more than just incompetence. It was, Dunn and others suggested, behavior indicative of a stand-down order. Third, there was the mysterious loss of key security camera footage. In a penthouse that was one of the most secure locations on Earth, the tapes from the crucial period were, according to reports, conveniently missing or damaged. Fourth, there was the motive. Could a small fire in a wastebasket, lit by a nurse with a candle, truly have been the sole cause of a blaze so intense it killed 2 people through an armored door? These inconsistencies fueled the conspiracy theories that the official story was a cover-up. One theory, promoted by the French newspaper Le Nouvel Observateur and others, was that the Russian mafia had in fact ordered the hit, just as Safra had feared. They had found a way to infiltrate the building, perhaps with inside help, and had set the fires. Maher, in this version, was either a pawn or a patsy, his intruder story a panicked true account that the Monaco authorities, desperate to protect their principality's reputation as a safe haven for billionaires, had systematically suppressed. They needed a lone crazy American to blame, not a full-scale war between Russian oligarchs on their soil. The motive for the cover-up was clear. The truth would destroy Monaco's economy, which was and is based entirely on its reputation for security. Lily Safra, now one of the richest widows in the world, moved with the same speed and strategic brilliance her late husband had displayed in business. She immediately pivoted the Safra name away from the dark, suspicious, and sordid world of Russian money, bungled rescues, and Monaco fires. She would rebrand the Safra legacy, using the $1.4 billion now in her foundation as a global force for philanthropy. The Edmond J. Safra Philanthropic Foundation exploded onto the world stage. Lily announced a massive $50 million pledge for Parkinson's disease research, endowing chairs at Harvard and Tulane, and becoming a major funder of the Michael J. Fox Foundation. The move was both deeply personal, a tribute to her late husband's suffering, and a public relations masterstroke. This was just the beginning. The foundation began pouring hundreds of millions into its core missions: education, medicine, and Jewish religious life. Lily funded the construction of 100 synagogues across the globe. She endowed the ISEF Scholarship Fund, supporting 20,000 Israeli students, She created professorships at Harvard, Wharton, and other elite universities. In 2012, in a final spectacular act of public generosity, she auctioned her personal jewelry collection for $38 million, donating the entire proceeds to charity. Through this relentless, high-profile giving, Lily Safra successfully completed the project Edmond had started. She washed the Safra name clean. She transformed it from a symbol of secretive, nervous money into a global brand of benevolence. The mystery of the Monaco fire, the allegations of Russian mafia hits, and the questions about Ted Mayer's coerced confession were not answered. They were simply buried under an avalanche of good deeds. Ted Mayer himself was convicted by a Monaco court in 2002. He was found guilty of arson causing death and sentenced to 10 years in prison. The Monaco authorities officially closed the case, sticking to the lone disgruntled nurse story. The conspiracy theories, however, have never died. The Monaco fire remains for many an unsolved murder, a final dark secret at the heart of the mysterious Safra dynasty. The death of Edmond J. Safra in the smoke-filled bunker of his Monaco penthouse was not the end of the Safra story. It was a violent schism, splitting the dynasty into two distinct, powerful, and deeply suspicious factions. The fire that killed the patriarch also ignited a cold war within the family, a battle fought not with weapons, but with wealth, lawyers, and public relations. This was the final tragic unraveling of the family's quiet power, a disintegration that revealed the deep-seated rivalries and personal tragedies that had long been hidden behind the family's impenetrable wall of secrecy. The battle lines were drawn almost immediately, literally, over Edmond's body. The two surviving Safra brothers, Joseph and Moise Safra, the patriarchs of the massive, independent Brazilian banking empire, flew to Monaco expecting to take charge. They were the blood family, the guardians of the Safra name and the ancient Sephardic traditions. They expected their brother, a devout Jew, to be flown to Israel for a traditional burial alongside their ancestors. They were wrong. They were met instead by Edmond's widow, Lily Safra. Lily Safra was, in her own right, one of the most formidable and enigmatic figures in global society. This was her fourth marriage. Her first, to an Argentine hosiery magnate, had ended in divorce. Her second, to Brazilian entrepreneur Alfredo Freddy Monteverde, had ended in 1969 when he died by suicide. That death, too, was shrouded in mystery. Monteverde had shot himself, but his body was found in his home, which was, according to some reports, also on fire. Lily had inherited his entire massive fortune, including control of the Ponto Frio department store chain in Brazil, making her an immensely wealthy woman in her own right. Her third marriage, a brief 13-month affair with a young businessman, ended quickly. In 1976, she married Edmond Safra. Theirs was a union of two colossal fortunes and two complex personalities. They had been together for 23 years, a partnership of power and wealth, though they had no children together. Lily's life, however, was also marked by its own unfathomable personal tragedy. In 1983, her youngest son from her second marriage, Claudio Monteverde, was killed in a horrific car accident, along with his 3-year-old son, her grandson. This loss, according to friends, deeply scarred Lily, fueling both her own intense paranoia about security and her later massive philanthropic drives. Now, in the chaotic aftermath of the 1999 fire, Lily Safra, the survivor, took total control. She allegedly blocked her brothers-in-law, Joseph and Moise, from the inner circle of decision-making. In a move that was seen as a profound public and private snub to the Brazilian Safras and their traditionalist views, she decreed that Edmond's funeral would not be held in Israel. It would be held in Geneva, the heart of her and Edmond's European empire, her own center of power. The funeral was a somber, high-security affair attended by the global elite, but the family rift was visible to all. According to reports by Vanity Fair journalist Dominic Dunn, who chronicled the saga, Joseph and Moisey Safra were treated not as grieving brothers, but as mere guests. They were allegedly excluded from the primary family mourning rituals, a signal of their new status. The war for the Safra legacy had begun. The second blow came with the reading of the will. Edmond's personal fortune, now liquid from the $9.4 billion HSBC sale, was estimated at $2.8 billion. The will was a strategic masterpiece that solidified Lily's power. It left the vast bulk of the fortune, reportedly 50%, not to the extended Safra family, but to the Edmond J. Safra Philanthropic Foundation. The foundation's charter named its chairperson, with total control over its assets and giving, as Lily Safra. The brothers, along with Edmond's sisters, received significant bequests, but the message was clear. Lily, the fourth wife, the Goy woman who had converted to Judaism for the marriage, was now the sole custodian of Edmond's name and legacy. The Brazilian Safras, who controlled their own separate, massive empire, had been effectively cut out of their brothers. This schism created two separate Safra dynasties. The first and most public was the dynasty of Lily Safra. Wielding the foundation's $1.4 billion endowment, she embarked on one of the most brilliant and effective philanthropic rebrandings in modern history. She understood, just as her late husband had, that the Safra name was now toxic, associated with Russian oligarchs, money laundering, and a bizarre unsolved death in a billionaire's bunker. She would wash it clean with a tidal wave of benevolence. Her strategy was both personal and politically shrewd. She made Parkinson's disease research her signature cause, a deeply personal tribute to Edmond's suffering. She announced a $50 million Edmond J. Safra Parkinson's research program, endowing permanent chairs at Harvard Medical School, Tulane University, and other institutions. She became a primary funder of the Michael J. Fox Foundation, linking the Safra name to one of the most beloved and trusted public figures in the world. Simultaneously, she aggressively reinforced the family's commitment to Jewish life and education, honoring Edmond's devout faith. The foundation funded the construction of over 100 synagogues across the globe, from Madrid to Moscow. It endowed the ISEF Scholarship Fund, supporting 20,000 disadvantaged Israeli students. It funded Holocaust education, university programs at Wharton and Harvard, and medical facilities. Lily Safra became a global philanthropic powerhouse, a fixture at charity galas, a patron of the arts, and a member of the world's most exclusive social circles. Her personal wealth was just as staggering. Her primary residence, La Leopolda, a palatial estate on the French Riviera, once owned by King Leopold II of Belgium, was valued at over $500 million, making it one of the most expensive private homes on earth. In 2012, in a final act of high-profile generosity, she auctioned her personal jewelry collection for $38 million, a world record, donating every cent to 32 different charities. By the time of her death in 2022, Lily Safra had successfully transformed the public memory of Edmond Safra. He was no longer the shadowy banker to Russian oligarchs. He was the benevolent patron of science, education, and religion. The second Safra dynasty, the one of the bloodline, retreated in the opposite direction. Led by Joseph Y. Safra, Edmond's younger brother, the Brazilian Safras went quiet. Joseph, who had his own complex and often rivalrous relationship with Edmond, was a banking genius in his own right, but he was a man cut from his father Jacob's original secretive Aleppo cloth. He despised the high-profile, glamorous New York style of his brother and sister-in-law. While Lily was holding galas, Joseph was quietly consolidating his empire. He bought out his brother Moise's share of the family's Brazilian and international holdings, becoming the sole patriarch of J. Safra Group. He ran his banks with the same paranoid, high liquidity, high secrecy principles as his father. In 2013, in a major power move, he acquired the Swiss private bank Saracen, merging it with his existing holdings to create J. Safra Saracen. He was, in effect, recreating his brother Edmond's Geneva empire, but under his own stricter, quieter control. When Joseph Safra died in 2020, he was the richest banker in the world, with a personal net worth estimated by Forbes at $16 to $20 billion. He left his own massive globe-spanning empire to his children, who continue to run it with the same legendary secrecy. The Brazilian Safras had proven that while Lily may have won control of Edmond's legacy, they had retained control of the dynasty's core business. The family disintegration was, in reality, a strategic split, a cellular division that created two massive, independent, and philosophically opposed empires, both bearing the Safra name. Handelman's conclusion, shared by many, was that the official story, while bizarre, was the most likely. Ted Meyer, an unstable man with a history of self-aggrandizement, had staged the event. The conspiracy was not in the murder, but in the appalling incompetence and subsequent cover-up by the Monaco authorities, who lost evidence and botched the rescue in their panic. Ultimately, the true Safra legacy is not a global conspiracy. It is a story of quiet power and its limitations. The family's real-world influence was and remains immense. Edmond's banks were a key conduit for global capital and his strategic philanthropy. His funding of over 100 synagogues, his massive support for Israel, his endowments at Harvard and Wharton was a masterful use of soft power, building a wall of goodwill and respectability around his controversial business. But the Safra dynasty, unlike the Rockefellers or the Maxwells, never sought the public stage. They were the bankers to the powerful, not the powerful themselves. The allegations that haunted them, from the American Express smears to the Russian money laundering scandal, were the natural consequence of their chosen business, providing secret, secure banking for the world's nervous money. When you build a fortress for the world's richest and most paranoid people, you will inevitably attract clients who have a good reason to be paranoid. The final verdict on the Safras is a study in contradiction. They are a dynasty defined by centuries-old traditions of trust, yet plagued by modern suspicions of high-level crime. Edmond Safra was a banking genius who built an empire on avoiding risk, yet he died because of a risk he couldn't control, either the paranoia of his patient or the enemies he had made. And the family's quiet power, designed to ensure their invisibility, ultimately made them the perfect subjects for the wildest conspiracy theories. The fire in Monaco did more than just kill a man. It illuminated for a brief, intense moment the high-stakes hidden world of offshore wealth and the profound, often fatal mysteries that lie at the heart of a dynasty built on secrets.